Hey guys, at first glance, the 1950s kitchen can look like a tidy little museum of progress. All chrome edges, cheerful colors, and machines that promise to turn domestic life into something almost effortless. But the stranger truth is that many of those gadgets did not really remove work at all. They simply repackaged it, dressed it up, and sold it back as convenience. And before we settle in, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quiet like on the video is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past, feel free to subscribe. To understand why so many oddly specific kitchen gadgets found their way into American homes in the 1950s, it helps to begin with something that modern viewers often miss. These objects were not just bits of harmless clutter. They sat at the intersection of post-war abundance, advertising, gender expectations, and a new idea of what a modern home was supposed to look like. Many of them were impractical, some were redundant, and a few were genuinely helpful. But all of them belonged to a world in which buying the right object could feel like a moral act, a social signal, and a promise of personal improvement all at once. The years after the Second World War were marked, in the United States especially, by a remarkable expansion of consumer culture. Factories that had once produced for wartime needs turned toward household goods. New suburban developments spread outward from cities. More families had access to electricity, more homes were being built around modern appliances, and manufacturers were eager to invent not only products but needs. The kitchen became one of the most important stages for this transformation. It was no longer only a workspace. It was increasingly presented as a showroom of domestic modernity, a place where efficiency, taste, and femininity could all be displayed in one polished room. That is part of what makes the subject slightly uncomfortable. The gadgets themselves were often silly, but the pressure surrounding them was not. Women were told, sometimes very gently and sometimes quite directly, that a good wife and mother should keep up with the latest methods, save time without appearing careless, and create an atmosphere of abundance without visible strain. The ideal kitchen of the 1950s was supposed to look effortless. But effortless things usually require a great deal of effort somewhere behind the scenes. So when a housewife bought a specialized egg slicer, a decorative gelatin mold, a sandwich press with a very narrow purpose, or a curious mechanical peeler that worked less well than an ordinary knife, she was not necessarily being foolish. She was operating inside a culture that treated novelty as progress. If a new gadget appeared in a magazine spread beside smiling children and spotless counters, it did not arrive as an isolated tool. It arrived as part of a larger promise. It suggested that a better organized life, a more modern home, and perhaps even a more admired identity could be achieved through the purchase of one more clever device. The irony, of course, is that many of these gadgets did not simplify domestic labor so much as multiply its forms. A hand mixer might genuinely save time. A refrigerator, a reliable stove, or an automatic dishwasher could change daily routines in substantial ways. But the 1950s also produced a flood of smaller devices that solved problems few people had ever truly suffered from. There were tools to separate eggs in ornamental ways, contraptions for shaping patties or slicing bananas with uniform neatness, dispensers for wrapped butter, presses for decorative canapes, specialized openers, courers, crushers, and molds for foods that had long been prepared perfectly well without them. And each new gadget introduced its own quiet burden. It had to be stored somewhere. It had to be washed. It had to justify the drawer space it consumed. It had to be remembered. The promise of efficiency often ended in another awkward object rattling at the back of a cabinet, used once at a church luncheon or holiday gathering, and then left to rest under cleaner, simpler tools that had never needed a sales pitch at all. There is also something revealing in the kinds of foods these gadgets were built around. Mid-century American food culture, especially in its aspirational magazine version, was full of molded salads, canapés, cocktail snacks, frosted cakes, decorative hors d'oeuvres, and dishes that signaled abundance through presentation as much as taste. A gadget was often less about nourishment than display. It helped produce food that looked modern, refined, or party-ready. This was an era fascinated by the idea that the ordinary could be transformed through design. Even a tomato slice or a boiled egg could be made to appear more elegant if one owned the proper device. That may sound trivial, but in a society increasingly oriented around image, the trivial mattered. The kitchen was not entirely private. Friends visited. Neighbors compared. Women's magazines offered advice that was half practical instruction and half gentle surveillance. Domestic competence was visible in table settings, in recipes, in how smoothly a hostess moved through a meal, and in whether her home reflected the new consumer ideals of the age. A woman did not merely cook. She performed domestic modernity. Some of the most wasteful gadgets were wasteful precisely because they turned broad skills into tiny mechanical rituals. Instead of knowing how to cut, whisk, grate, strain, or peel with a few durable tools, the consumer was encouraged to outsource each motion to a separate object. This was presented as scientific housekeeping, an appealing phrase in the mid-century world. The home, like the office or factory, could supposedly be optimized. Time and motion thinking, industrial design, and advertising language seeped into domestic life. The result was a kitchen full of devices that implied labor could be broken into ever smaller, more manageable units. But human beings do not always live better when every action is fragmented. In fact, one of the more interesting reversals of the era is that while these gadgets were marketed as symbols of liberation, they could reinforce the expectation that women should devote even more attention to domestic detail. If there was now a special instrument for shaping perfect canapés, serving flawless molded desserts, or preparing party snacks with decorative precision, then the standard quietly rose. Convenience did not always mean freedom. Sometimes it meant refinement of the performance. The housewife was not released from scrutiny. She was given new equipment with which to meet it. This helps explain why even poorly designed gadgets could sell. Their value was partly symbolic. To buy them was to participate in the future. The future in 1950s advertising was bright, smooth, hygienic, and mechanized. It gleamed. It did not smell of drudgery. It certainly did not resemble the hot, repetitive, tiring work that had defined kitchen labor for generations. Even modest households were invited into this vision. You might not own every large appliance shown in the magazines, but perhaps you could buy a new slicer, a polished dispenser, a compact electric helper, and feel that your home, too, was keeping pace. And there was another reason these gadgets proliferated. They made excellent gifts. Bridal showers, holiday exchanges, neighborhood parties, catalog orders, and department store promotions all favored small domestic items that seemed clever and modern. A specialized kitchen tool was affordable enough to purchase, attractive enough to package, and respectable enough to give. It carried a flattering implication. This will help you in your new home. This will make your work easier. This is what modern women use now. Whether it actually helped was sometimes almost beside the point. The packaging itself mattered. Many of these items were sold in boxes decorated with streamlined fonts, optimistic illustrations, and reassuring language about labor-saving design. That design language deserves a little attention because it made mediocrity look advanced. A tool that did one awkward thing tolerably well could still seem futuristic if it had shiny trim and a persuasive slogan. The consumer was not only buying metal, plastic, or glass. She was buying a story about order, intelligence, and modern living. Yet the daily experience of the kitchen remained stubbornly physical. Meals still had to be planned. Children still had to be fed on time. Dishes still accumulated. Surfaces still needed wiping. Laundry and shopping still absorbed hours. One reason the odd little gadgets of the 1950s can feel so poignant now is that they reveal a mismatch between fantasy and routine. The fantasy suggested that the modern home was gliding toward ease. The routine still involved repetitive labor, emotional management, and a great deal of invisible effort. In that sense, the most extravagant or unnecessary gadgets tell us more than the genuinely useful ones. A dependable refrigerator tells us that infrastructure was improving. A pointless olive pitter with an uncomfortable grip tells us something more intimate. It tells us what manufacturers thought women could be persuaded to worry about. It tells us how narrow a domestic task could become once turned into a market opportunity. And it tells us how often the culture confused novelty with relief. It is also worth pausing over the word wasted, because even that deserves some nuance. From one angle, yes, money was wasted on plenty of forgettable devices. But from another angle, the purchase was often an attempt to buy time, status, reassurance, or participation in a changing world. The waste was not always irrational. It was shaped by aspiration, pressure, loneliness, and hope. In suburban settings especially, where many women spent long hours managing households that could appear comfortable from the outside but isolating from within, consumer goods sometimes offered a sense of motion and reward. Something new had entered the home. Something had improved, or at least seemed to. That emotional dimension mattered. The 1950s ideal of cheerful domesticity could be deeply confining. Popular culture often presented the happy homemaker as fulfilled by appliances, recipes, and tasteful organization, but real lives were usually more complex. A gadget might arrive as a small thrill, a token of self-respect, a practical experiment, or simply a break in routine. Even disappointment had its own rhythm. The object failed, the drawer filled, the promise faded, and then another product appeared with a fresh claim. So beneath the charming absurdity of these devices lies a larger historical story. It is the story of a society learning to equate consumption with competence, of advertising turning tiny inconveniences into purchasable problems, and of women being asked to embody progress in one of the most labor-intensive rooms in the house. The kitchen gadget boom was not just about clutter. It was about faith in technology, faith in appearances, and faith in the idea that the right tool might finally bring the ordered life that the culture kept describing. And as the decade moved forward, that faith did not disappear. If anything, it became more elaborate. As kitchens themselves were redesigned, plastics became more common, electric devices multiplied, and the distinction between real convenience and decorative convenience grew even harder to see. Because once a culture becomes skilled at inventing desires, it rarely stops at the first drawer full of unnecessary tools. It simply finds new corners of the room to fill. It simply finds new corners of the room to fill. And in the 1950s kitchen, those corners began to fill with a very particular kind of object. Not the great transformative machines that genuinely altered household routines, but the smaller, more theatrical instruments of modern domestic life, the gadgets that lived halfway between tool and performance. One of the reasons these devices multiplied so easily was that they took advantage of a real change in the structure of the American home. By the middle of the decade, many households had already absorbed the first wave of major appliances. Refrigerators, electric ranges, toasters, and mixers had become increasingly common in middle-class settings. Once those foundational purchases were made, manufacturers needed new products to sell. The obvious solution was not merely to improve the large machines, but to extend the logic of mechanized convenience downward into smaller and smaller tasks. If breakfast could be electrified, then perhaps hors d'oeuvres could be too. If baking had become more efficient, then perhaps peeling, slicing, coring, stuffing, grating, juicing, crimping, and decorating could each be given their own branded assistant. This is where the kitchen gadget becomes especially revealing, because many of these products were sold not on necessity, but on specificity. Their pitch depended on taking an occasional or minor inconvenience and treating it as though it were a persistent domestic challenge. A woman who had sliced bread, chopped vegetables, and prepared family meals for years without complaint might suddenly be told that her life lacked a proper deviled egg tray, a strawberry huller, a pastry wheel with decorative edges, or a compact machine dedicated to shelling peas in a more orderly fashion. None of these things had to be wholly useless to be wasteful. They only had to offer too little in exchange for the money, space, and attention they demanded. And space, though it is easy to overlook, mattered a great deal. The idealized 1950s kitchen in advertisements appeared bright, spacious, and rationally organized. Cabinets shut smoothly, counters shone. Drawers seemed deep enough to absorb any number of specialized tools without friction. But actual homes varied enormously. Many kitchens were modest. Storage was limited. Households accumulated objects faster than they discarded them. The result was often a creeping clutter concealed behind neat cabinet doors. A gadget purchased in optimism could very quickly become an irritant, not because it had broken, but because it occupied room that older, simpler tools had once used more efficiently. There is a quiet comedy in that, but also a kind of historical honesty. The dream of the perfectly equipped modern kitchen was often at war with the realities of ordinary domestic space. A small hand-operated slicer might look ingenious in a catalog illustration, particularly when shown against an uncluttered counter and a smiling hostess in a pressed dress. But once brought home, it had to live somewhere. It had to be cleaned after use. It had to be found again. And its owner had to decide, perhaps with a touch of embarrassment, whether the time saved on one task had been lost again in washing its gears, wiping its surfaces, and fitting it awkwardly back into a crowded drawer. The decorative side of these products made the contradiction even sharper. Some gadgets existed not simply to prepare food, but to shape it into forms associated with refinement, novelty, or social success. Consider the vast mid-century enthusiasm for molded foods, sandwich variations, ornamental cakes, cocktail hour snacks, and neatly portioned finger foods. A gadget could help turn something plain into something presentable. It could trim crusts into elegant edges, shape butter into curls, press dough into uniform shells, or stamp canapes into tidy little circles. These are small things, but they tell us that presentation had become part of the labor. It was no longer enough to feed people adequately. The food, especially in aspirational settings, was expected to look composed, modern, and faintly effortless. That word effortless keeps returning because it sat at the center of the fantasy. The model homemaker was not supposed to appear burdened, even when she plainly was. The polished kitchen, the smiling hostess, the well-timed meal, the child-friendly dessert, the husband returning to an orderly home. All of these were connected in popular imagery. Gadgets fed that imagery beautifully because they suggested invisible help. Even when the labor remained, the housewife could feel equipped. She had tools. She had solutions. She had purchased some measure of control over the endless recurrence of household tasks. Yet very often these devices exposed the limits of that promise. Take, for example, the proliferation of highly specialized cutters and slicers. The logic behind them was superficially persuasive. Why rely on hand skill when a shaped blade or fixed frame could guarantee uniformity? But uniformity is not always the same as usefulness. A banana slicer may produce even rounds, but a knife can do the same in a moment and without introducing another object into the wash. An egg slicer can indeed create neat pieces, but only if one wishes to store and retrieve a tool for a task performed in seconds by hand. The gadget transformed a simple skill into a miniature system, and for some buyers that system carried the appealing aura of precision. It made kitchen work feel managed, almost professional. That attraction to precision was part of a larger mid-century admiration for systems. In the post-war years, scientific language carried prestige. Homes were to be better planned, better arranged, better ventilated, better lit, better managed. The kitchen was increasingly described through design principles, work triangles, traffic flow, and labor-saving layout. Some of this was sensible and genuinely useful. A kitchen arranged for easier movement could reduce strain. Better refrigeration and storage improved food safety. But once the language of rational management entered the room, it could easily be exaggerated. Every tiny motion became a candidate for improvement. Every repetitive task invited a purchasable refinement. The result was a marketplace in which even trivial actions acquired a kind of pseudo-engineering. That pseudo-engineering often mattered more in print than in practice. Women's magazines, department store displays, and television advertisements were extremely good at making these objects seem integrated into a broader pattern of modern life. The gadget was rarely shown as absurd. It was shown as part of a cheerful, competent rhythm. A well-appointed woman moved from refrigerator to counter to serving tray with calm efficiency. Her kitchen tools seemed coordinated, tasteful, and sensible. The scene reassured the viewer that domestic order could be not only achieved, but enjoyed. But the enjoyment being sold was often inseparable from social comparison. One reason the post-war kitchen became such a fertile market was that the home had become a public measure of private virtue. Women invited neighbors in for coffee, hosted bridge groups, arranged children's birthdays, prepared church suppers, and participated in a suburban culture where domestic standards circulated constantly through observation and conversation. The kitchen gadget, especially the visible or giftable one, worked inside that network of comparison. It said something about attentiveness, modernity, and participation. Even when tucked away, it belonged to a larger world of demonstration. That helps us understand why some of the least necessary gadgets were also the most appealing in moments of display. A corn kernel remover, a decorative aspic mold, a novelty sandwich maker, a glass butter dispenser, a mechanical frosting aid, or a chrome-plated hors d'oeuvre set might be used rarely, but it was memorable. It had presence. It seemed to embody care. The owner had not merely prepared food. She had prepared it with equipment that suggested thought and refinement. In this sense, many gadgets were not purchased for everyday life alone. They were purchased for imagined occasions, for dinners that might happen, for compliments that might be earned, for a self that might feel slightly more polished. And imagined occasions are often powerful sellers. The 20th century is full of products bought for the life people hoped to lead rather than the life they actually lived. The 1950s kitchen was no exception. A woman might buy a gadget for cocktail parties even if she hosted only a few each year. She might invest in specialized baking tools for holiday display. She might purchase a labor-saving device on the promise that it would change her routine, only to find that the older method felt quicker, more intuitive, and less troublesome. None of this was accidental. Advertising thrives where aspiration exceeds habit. There was also a generational dimension to some of these purchases. Younger brides setting up homes in the post-war years entered a consumer environment far denser than that of their mothers. Wedding registries, department stores, and magazine features all guided them toward the ideal equipment of married life. The kitchen became a symbolic frontier of adulthood. To possess the proper implements was to seem prepared. Even those who privately found certain gadgets unnecessary might still accept or display them because they belonged to the expected material vocabulary of a respectable home. This is where the story becomes more than one of foolish spending. These gadgets reveal the emotional architecture of domestic aspiration. Buying them could be a way of rehearsing competence. It could soften the uncertainty of new marriage, new neighborhoods, or new routines. It could make a woman feel less improvised and more established. That emotional function did not make the products more effective, but it helps explain why ineffective products could still circulate so widely. They served the imagination even when they failed the countertop. And of course, some gadgets occupied a peculiar middle ground. They were not entirely useless, but their usefulness was inflated far beyond reason. Hand-crank choppers, sifters, molds, presses, and dispensers might offer modest convenience under the right conditions. Yet manufacturers treated modest convenience as revolution. That inflation of promise is one of the most recognizable habits of mid-century domestic marketing. The object did not have to change life dramatically. It only had to be framed as the small improvement that the conscientious modern homemaker ought not overlook. The language around hygiene gave these products even more persuasive force. Post-war consumers were highly receptive to claims about cleanliness, sanitation, and scientific food handling. A covered butter dish or specialized dispenser could be marketed not just as elegant but as hygienic. A gadget that reduced hand contact with food might be presented as cleaner, more modern, more in tune with contemporary standards. This mattered because cleanliness had moral weight. It was not merely practical. A clean kitchen signaled discipline, care, and respectability. Gadgets that promise cleanliness could therefore sell on more than utility alone. The irony, again, is that added mechanisms often created new places for grime to hide. Hinges, springs, wires, little chambers, shaped grooves, decorative molds, and complicated handles were not always easy to wash thoroughly. In some cases, the simpler tool was probably cleaner precisely because it was simpler. But simplicity rarely wins in an age intoxicated by novelty. The new object, especially if packaged attractively and described in the language of science, often appeared superior before it had ever proved itself in use. By the late 1950s, plastics added another layer to this world. They made it easier and cheaper to produce colorful, lightweight kitchen aids in large numbers. Plastic could look modern, cheerful, and up-to-date. Could also make a gadget feel less like a serious implement and more like an affordable domestic accessory. That distinction mattered. A family might hesitate before purchasing a major appliance, but a bright, cleverly advertised tool priced within reach could slip much more easily into the weekly or monthly flow of consumption. The low individual cost of many gadgets helped disguise the cumulative extravagance. One item seemed harmless. A kitchen full of them told a different story. And yet the household economy of the 1950s was not limitless. Many families still budgeted carefully. Many women were acutely aware of waste. That tension created another interesting feature of the era: the persistent effort by advertisers to make indulgence look prudent. A gadget was cast not as a treat, but as an investment. It would save time, reduce effort, prevent mess, improve results, stretch ingredients, or help one entertain more economically at home. The purchase could thus be moralized. Spending on the right object became a form of good management. This mattered especially in a culture that still retained memories of Depression-era frugality. Many adults in the 1950s had grown up with scarcity or wartime rationing. Manufacturers knew this. They could not simply urge wastefulness outright. Instead, they wrapped novelty in the language of thrift and planning. The buyer was not being frivolous. She was being sensible in a modern way. That rhetorical shift is one reason so many unnecessary tools felt respectable. They arrived disguised as discipline. Beneath all of this was an unresolved contradiction that would keep shaping domestic life across the decade. The culture celebrated efficiency, but also elevated display. Praised thrift, but encouraged constant purchasing. It spoke of reducing labor, but often expanded expectations around meals, presentation, and household order. The kitchen gadget sat exactly in the middle of that contradiction. It was a tiny machine for reconciling impossible demands. Be economical but modern. Be relaxed but polished. Save time but do more. Buy less carelessly, but keep up with what is new. And once that contradiction became embedded in the everyday life of the home, it did not remain confined to gadgets alone. It began to influence the architecture of the kitchen, the aesthetics of storage, the rituals of entertaining, and even the way domestic competence itself was imagined. Because the strange little tools were only one layer of a broader transformation. Beneath them, quietly taking shape, was a new domestic landscape in which the kitchen would become not just a room for preparing food, but a stage for post-war identity, consumer discipline, and the polished performance of modern family life. Because the strange little tools were only one layer of a broader transformation, what sat beneath them was even more revealing. A gradual reshaping of how the kitchen itself was meant to function, not just as a workspace, but as a visible expression of order, efficiency, and quiet success. By the mid to late 1950s, the idea of the modern kitchen had become increasingly standardized. Designers, advertisers, and home economists promoted layouts that were meant to reduce unnecessary movement and create a sense of logical flow. The now familiar concept of the kitchen work triangle, linking the stove, sink, and refrigerator, was presented as a rational solution to everyday labor. In many cases, this kind of planning did improve comfort. It reduced steps, simplified routines, and reflected a genuine attempt to apply thoughtful design to domestic work. But alongside these useful changes came something more subtle. Once the kitchen was framed as a system, every part of it could be evaluated, optimized, and, importantly, purchased. Cabinets were not just storage. They were opportunities for built-in organizers. Counters were not just surfaces. They were spaces to be kept visually uncluttered, which in turn encouraged the hiding, stacking, or replacing of older tools with newer, more efficient ones. Drawers were redesigned with compartments, racks, and sliding inserts that implied a place for everything, even if that everything included gadgets that had no real place in daily life. This is where the relationship between clutter and control becomes especially interesting. On the surface, the 1950s kitchen appears cleaner and more orderly than those of earlier decades. And in many ways it was. But that visible order often depended on concealing a growing accumulation of objects. The tidy countertop was achieved not by owning less, but by storing more out of sight. The cabinet doors closed on an expanding inventory of tools, some useful, some redundant, some barely used at all. That hidden accumulation mattered because it subtly changed the rhythm of kitchen work. A task that once involved reaching for a familiar, well-worn tool might now involve searching for a specialized device, assembling it, using it briefly, and then dealing with the small aftermath it created. The time saved in one motion could easily be lost in another. But because the kitchen still looked orderly, the illusion of efficiency remained intact. There is also a quieter psychological effect at play here. When a space is filled with objects designed for very specific purposes, it can create a sense that those purposes should be fulfilled more often. A drawer full of decorative molds, cutters, and presses does not simply sit there neutrally. It suggests possibility. It hints at dishes not yet made, at presentations not yet attempted, at a level of domestic performance that feels just within reach. The tools themselves become a kind of gentle pressure, encouraging the homemaker to live up to the potential they represent. And this pressure did not exist in isolation. It was reinforced by a steady stream of media that continued to raise expectations in small but cumulative ways. Women's magazines rarely demanded perfection outright, but they consistently showcased homes that appeared calm, well-equipped, and quietly impressive. Recipes were presented alongside images of finished dishes that looked neat, structured, and modern. Advice columns encouraged better organization, more thoughtful planning, more efficient routines. The tone was rarely harsh. It did not need to be. The repetition alone was enough to shape behavior. In this environment, the kitchen gadget served as both solution and symbol. It offered a concrete way to respond to abstract expectations. If one felt that her meals were not quite refined enough, there was a tool to help. If her presentation lacked variety, there was a device designed to create it. If her routine felt tiring, there was always something marketed as labor-saving. The gap between reality and ideal could be bridged, at least temporarily, by acquiring one more object. But as the decade progressed, a quiet tension began to emerge between the promise of simplification and the lived experience of managing so many specialized items. Some women embraced the gadgets enthusiastically, enjoying the sense of novelty and the small efficiencies they occasionally provided. Others used them sparingly, keeping them as part of a larger domestic toolkit without relying on them heavily. And some, over time, began to recognize that the older methods, the ones that relied on skill, habit, and a few versatile tools, were often just as effective, if not more so. This recognition did not necessarily lead to a rejection of consumer culture. The 1950s was not a decade of widespread resistance to domestic consumption. But it did create a subtle distinction between the ideal kitchen as imagined by advertisers and the practical kitchen as managed day by day. In the practical kitchen, decisions were constantly being made about what was worth the effort. A gadget might be used once, admired briefly, and then quietly set aside in favor of a simpler approach. Interestingly, this pattern of selective use created a kind of informal filtering process. Over time, certain tools proved their worth and remained in regular rotation. Others faded into the background. The kitchen, in this sense, became a layered space, containing both the enduring and the experimental, the necessary and the aspirational. And this layering reflects something important about mid-century domestic life. It was not as uniformly polished as the images suggested. It was adaptive, negotiated, and often quietly pragmatic beneath the surface. At the same time, manufacturers did not slow down. If anything, they became more inventive in how they framed their products. Rather than simply offering tools, they began to sell coordinated experiences. Sets of gadgets were marketed together, implying that true efficiency required a complete system. Color coordination became more prominent, encouraging consumers to match their tools to their kitchens, their appliances, and even their sense of personal style. The gadget was no longer just a helper, it was part of a visual language. This shift toward coordination is worth pausing over, because it further blurred the line between necessity and decoration. A brightly colored utensil set, a matching series of containers, or a neatly designed collection of small appliances could make a kitchen feel modern and unified. But that unity often required replacing perfectly functional items with newer ones that fit the desired aesthetic. The result was a cycle in which visual harmony became another reason to purchase, even when practical need was minimal. The role of television also grew during this period, subtly reinforcing these patterns. Cooking shows, advertisements, and sponsored segments introduced viewers to new tools in a format that felt both instructional and aspirational. A host might demonstrate how quickly a gadget could perform a task, how neatly it could shape a dish, or how easily it could be cleaned. These demonstrations were carefully staged. They minimized inconvenience and highlighted results. The viewer, watching from her own kitchen, could easily imagine incorporating the device into her routine. But imagination and reality rarely align perfectly. What appears smooth on screen often becomes more complicated in practice. The demonstration does not show the drawer where the gadget will be stored, the accumulation of similar tools already owned, or the small moments of friction that come with adding one more object to an already busy space. These omissions are not accidental. They are part of how the gadget maintains its appeal. There is also a broader cultural rhythm here that extends beyond the kitchen. The post-war years were marked by a deep optimism about technology and progress. New materials, new designs, and new methods were constantly emerging. The home was seen as a place where these innovations could be applied in everyday life. To participate in this progress was, in a sense, to participate in the future. The kitchen gadget, however trivial it might seem, was a small piece of that larger narrative. And yet, even as this optimism continued, small contradictions kept surfacing. A tool designed to save time might complicate a routine. A device meant to simplify work might require its own maintenance. An object purchased for efficiency might remain unused. These contradictions did not immediately undermine the broader belief in progress, but they did create moments of quiet reevaluation. The homemaker, standing in her kitchen, might begin to notice that not every promise translated into lived improvement. Those moments of recognition were rarely dramatic. They did not lead to sudden rejection or public critique. Instead, they accumulated slowly, shaping habits in subtle ways. A gadget might be used less often. Purchase might be reconsidered. A simpler method might be preferred. Over time, these small adjustments formed a kind of practical wisdom, one that existed alongside the ongoing flow of new products and new claims. And as the 1950s moved toward its later years, this practical wisdom would begin to intersect with another shift, one that had less to do with individual tools and more to do with the broader expectations placed on the kitchen itself. Because while gadgets continued to multiply, the role of the kitchen within the home was also beginning to change, quietly expanding beyond its traditional boundaries and drawing even more attention to the balance between appearance, effort, and the realities of everyday life. Because while gadgets continued to multiply, the role of the kitchen within the home was also beginning to change, quietly expanding beyond its traditional boundaries and drawing even more attention to the balance between appearance, effort, and the realities of everyday life. In earlier decades, the kitchen had often been a more contained, semi-private space, separated from the formal areas of the home. It was a place of work, not display. But by the late 1950s, that separation was beginning to soften. Architectural trends, especially in newer suburban homes, started to open the kitchen slightly toward dining areas, sometimes even toward living spaces. Pass-through windows, breakfast bars, and more fluid layouts allowed the person cooking to remain visually connected to family and guests. At first glance, this might seem like a small design change. But in practice, it shifted how kitchen labor was seen and how it was judged. Once the kitchen became partially visible, its standards changed. It was no longer enough for the work to be done. The space itself had to look as though it functioned smoothly. The absence of visible strain became part of the expectation. Counters had to remain clear. Surfaces had to look composed. Movements had to appear efficient. And in this more exposed environment, the presence or absence of certain tools could subtly signal how modern or well-equipped a household was. This visibility amplified the role of the kitchen gadget in a new way. A tool that might once have been tucked away now had the potential to be seen, commented on, or even admired. Certain devices, especially those that were visually distinctive, polished, or novel, began to function almost as conversation pieces. They suggested that the household was keeping pace with contemporary trends, that it was organized, thoughtful, and attentive to the evolving standards of domestic life. At the same time, the increased visibility of the kitchen made its contradictions harder to ignore. A space designed to look effortless still required constant maintenance. A counter cleared for display often meant that items had been hastily moved elsewhere. A meal prepared with apparent ease still depended on planning, timing, and physical effort that remained largely invisible. The kitchen was becoming a stage, but it was still supported by backstage work that had not disappeared. This is where the accumulation of gadgets could begin to feel particularly strained. The more objects a household owned, the more carefully they had to be managed to maintain the appearance of simplicity. A device used briefly during preparation might need to be hidden quickly before guests arrived. A collection of specialized tools might have to be arranged in such a way that they did not disrupt the visual calm of the room. The very tools that promised convenience could complicate the performance of ease. And yet, for many households, this performance was not entirely artificial. It was practiced, refined, and internalized over time. Women developed routines that allowed them to move efficiently through the kitchen, to anticipate needs, to prepare in stages, and to present the final result in a composed manner. The gadgets, in this context, became part of a larger choreography. Some were genuinely integrated into daily habits. Others were reserved for specific occasions. Still others remained largely unused, existing as quiet reminders of past intentions or unrealized plans. There is something important in that mixture of use and neglect. It shows that the 1950s kitchen was not a static environment shaped solely by advertising. It was a lived space, continuously adjusted by the people who inhabited it. A gadget might enter the home with a strong promise, but its fate was determined by experience. Did it actually save time? Was it easy to clean? Did it fit naturally into existing routines? If the answer to these questions was no, the object would gradually lose its place, even if it remained physically present. This process of quiet evaluation often took place without formal acknowledgement. There were no public declarations that a certain type of gadget had failed. Instead, the judgment was private and practical. A woman might simply stop reaching for a particular tool. She might return to older methods that felt more reliable. Over time, these small decisions shaped the real working environment of the kitchen in ways that differed from its idealized image. At the same time, the broader culture continued to encourage acquisition. The late 1950s saw an increasing emphasis on lifestyle branding, even if the term itself was not yet widely used. Products were no longer marketed solely as individual solutions, but as part of a cohesive way of living. A well-equipped kitchen was presented as an extension of personal identity. It reflected taste, discipline, and awareness of modern trends. To update one's tools was, in a subtle way, to update oneself. This connection between objects and identity made it more difficult to draw clear lines between necessity and excess. A gadget might not be strictly needed, but it could still feel appropriate, even expected. It might align with the image of a well-managed home. It might match the aesthetic of the kitchen. It might complete a set. In this sense, the decision to purchase was not always driven by practical calculation. It was influenced by a network of meanings that extended beyond the immediate function of the object. There is also a temporal dimension to consider. Many gadgets were tied to specific moments in the daily or weekly rhythm of the household. A device for preparing breakfast items, a tool for shaping baked goods, a set of implements for entertaining, each corresponded to a particular time and activity. This temporal structuring reinforced the idea that domestic life could be organized into distinct, manageable segments, each with its own appropriate tools. But real life rarely adheres perfectly to such segmentation. Tasks overlap. Time runs short. Unexpected needs arise. In these moments, flexibility becomes more valuable than specialization. A versatile knife, a sturdy bowl, a reliable pan. These basic tools often prove more useful than a collection of narrowly defined devices. And so, even in the most gadget-filled kitchens, there remained a core set of implements that carried the weight of everyday work. This coexistence of simplicity and specialization is one of the defining features of the period. The kitchen was both streamlined and crowded, efficient and over-equipped, modern and quietly traditional. It contained the latest innovations alongside long-established practices. And within this layered environment, the homemaker navigated a complex set of expectations, balancing the desire to be modern with the practical need to get things done. As the decade approached its end, another subtle shift began to take shape. The cultural narrative around domestic life started to broaden, incorporating new ideas about convenience, leisure, and the use of time. The promise of the earlier post-war years, that technology would steadily reduce household labor, had not fully materialized in the way many had imagined. Work had changed form, but it had not disappeared. And this gap between promise and experience created space for new questions. What exactly was the goal of all this efficiency? If time was being saved in small increments, where did that time go? Was the purpose to create more elaborate meals, more polished presentations, more frequent entertaining? Or was there an emerging desire, perhaps not yet fully articulated, for a different kind of domestic rhythm altogether? These questions did not immediately overturn existing patterns. The 1950s remained, in many ways, deeply committed to its vision of orderly, well-equipped domestic life. But the questions lingered. They appeared in small decisions, in moments of hesitation before a purchase, in the quiet recognition that not every new device improved the daily routine. And as new products continued to enter the market, some genuinely useful, others only marginally so, the kitchen became a place where these tensions were lived out in practical terms. Each drawer, each cabinet, each carefully arranged counter held not just objects, but choices. Choices about what to keep, what to use, what to ignore, and what to believe about the relationship between tools, labor, and the ideal of a modern home. Those choices, repeated across thousands of households, would gradually shape the next phase of domestic life, as the balance between accumulation and practicality, between appearance and experience, continued to evolve in ways that were not always visible from the outside, but were deeply felt within the quiet routines of the kitchen. Those choices, repeated across thousands of households, would gradually shape the next phase of domestic life, as the balance between accumulation and practicality, between appearance and experience, continued to evolve in ways that were not always visible from the outside, but were deeply felt within the quiet routines of the kitchen. One of the more subtle developments during this period was how these private adjustments began to influence the kinds of products that succeeded over time. While manufacturers continued to release highly specialized gadgets, not all of them endured in the same way. Some quietly disappeared from catalogs after only a few seasons, replaced by newer ideas or slightly rebranded variations. Others persisted, but often in simplified forms, suggesting that consumers were responding not only to novelty, but also to practicality in ways that advertising alone could not fully control. This gradual filtering process is easy to miss when looking back at the era through its most colorful or exaggerated examples. It is tempting to imagine the 1950s kitchen as uniformly filled with unnecessary tools. But in reality, there was a constant, almost invisible negotiation taking place. Each purchase was followed by a period of use, evaluation, and, in many cases, quiet abandonment. Over time, this created a distinction between what looked modern and what actually proved useful in daily life. That distinction began to shape expectations in subtle ways. A gadget that promised too much and delivered too little might still be admired briefly, but it would not become part of the regular rhythm of the household. And as these patterns repeated, a kind of informal knowledge circulated among women, often through conversation rather than formal advice. A neighbor might mention that a certain tool was more trouble than it was worth. A friend might demonstrate a simpler method. These small exchanges helped refine the collective understanding of what actually worked. At the same time, the market adapted by shifting emphasis toward devices that could justify their place more convincingly. Instead of focusing only on narrow, single-purpose tools, some manufacturers began to highlight versatility. Multifunction gadgets, those that could slice, grate, chop, or mix in different configurations, became more appealing, not necessarily because they were perfect, but because they seemed to offer better value for the space they occupied. The language of efficiency evolved slightly, becoming less about novelty alone and more about consolidation. But even this shift carried its own contradictions. A multifunction device might reduce the number of separate tools required, but it could also become more complex to use and clean. The promise of doing many things often came with the reality of managing multiple parts, attachments, and settings. Once again, the homemaker was asked to weigh potential convenience against actual experience, deciding whether the trade-off felt worthwhile. Another quiet but important development was the growing emphasis on speed. As the decade progressed, there was an increasing cultural interest in saving time, not just in isolated tasks, but across the entire daily routine. Quick meals, faster preparation methods, and streamlined cleanup began to take on greater importance. This shift did not eliminate the desire for presentation or variety, but it introduced a new layer of expectation that all of this could be achieved more quickly. This is where the limitations of many gadgets became more apparent. A device that required careful setup, produced modest results, and then needed thorough cleaning could feel less appealing in a context where speed was becoming more valuable. The earlier promise that any amount of mechanization was inherently beneficial began to encounter a practical test. Did it actually make things faster, or did it simply change the form of the work? In many cases, the answer was not as straightforward as the advertisements suggested. A gadget might speed up one step while slowing down another. It might produce a more uniform result but require more effort to maintain. It might work well under ideal conditions but prove less reliable in everyday use. These nuances mattered because they accumulated over time, shaping the overall experience of managing a household. At the same time, the emotional landscape of domestic life was also shifting, if only slightly. The earlier post-war optimism, with its strong emphasis on cheerful efficiency and visible order, began to coexist with a more complex awareness of the demands placed on homemakers. This awareness was not always openly expressed, but it could be felt in the small moments of friction. The extra minutes spent cleaning a complicated tool, the irritation of a gadget that failed to perform as promised, the quiet decision to return to a simpler method. These moments did not necessarily lead to dissatisfaction with the broader ideals of the time. Many women continued to take pride in well-run households, in organized kitchens, in meals that were both nourishing and presentable. But the gap between ideal and reality became a little more visible, at least within the private experience of daily work. And it is in that gap that the story of these gadgets becomes particularly revealing. They were not simply objects imposed from outside. They were part of an ongoing conversation between expectation and experience, between what was promised and what was lived. Each gadget carried with it a set of assumptions about how the kitchen should function, how time should be managed, and how domestic success should be measured. As these assumptions were tested, adjusted, and sometimes quietly set aside, the kitchen itself began to reflect a more layered understanding of modernity. It was no longer just a place where the newest tools automatically replaced the old. Instead, it became a space where different approaches coexisted. A woman might use a modern appliance for one task, a traditional method for another, and a selectively chosen gadget for a third. The result was not a perfectly streamlined system, but a practical arrangement shaped by experience. This layered approach also influenced how new products were received. By the end of the decade, consumers were not entirely passive recipients of advertising claims. They had accumulated their own knowledge, their own preferences, their own sense of what worked and what did not. A new gadget might still attract attention, but it would be evaluated against a growing body of personal experience. The novelty alone was no longer always enough. That said, the cycle of innovation and consumption did not slow down in any dramatic way. The broader economic and cultural forces driving the production of new household goods remained strong. Manufacturers continued to experiment, to repackage ideas, to introduce updated versions of familiar tools. The kitchen remained a central site for this activity, not only because of its practical importance, but because of its symbolic role in defining the modern home. And as the 1950s moved toward the threshold of the next decade, this symbolic role began to expand even further. The kitchen was no longer just a place where food was prepared and domestic competence was displayed. It was increasingly becoming a space where larger questions about time, identity, and the meaning of modern living were quietly negotiated through everyday choices. These questions did not yet have clear answers. They were embedded in routines, in purchases, in habits that formed gradually over time. But they set the stage for the changes that would follow, as new ideas about convenience, individuality, and the organization of daily life began to interact with the established patterns of the post-war home. And within that evolving landscape, the small, often overlooked kitchen gadget would continue to play its quiet role, not always as a solution, and not always as a success, but as a persistent reminder of how even the simplest tools can carry the weight of a much larger story still unfolding. Not always as a solution, and not always as a success, but as a persistent reminder of how even the simplest tools can carry the weight of a much larger story still unfolding. And as that story continued into the closing years of the 1950s, something else began to shift almost quietly beneath the surface. A gradual rebalancing of what counted as modern in the kitchen. For much of the decade, modernity had been associated with accumulation. More devices, more specialization, more visible signs of technical assistance. But now, in small and often unspoken ways, a different interpretation began to emerge. Modernity could also mean restraint, could mean choosing what worked, rather than simply owning what was new. This shift did not arrive as a clear movement or a widely declared idea. It revealed itself in habits. A drawer that was not replaced when it became too full. A gadget that was passed along, quietly discarded, or simply not used again. A preference for tools that performed reliably over those that promised novelty. These were small decisions, repeated across many households, and they carried a subtle but important implication. That experience was beginning to compete with advertising as a guide. At the same time, the pace of product turnover continued, and in some cases even accelerated. Manufacturers were now working within a more saturated market, which meant that new items had to appear not just useful, but distinct. Slight variations in shape, color, or function were introduced to differentiate one gadget from another. A slicer might be redesigned with a more compact form. A peeler might be marketed as safer, smoother, or more hygienic. A decorative tool might be reimagined with a new aesthetic that aligned with shifting tastes. But these changes also reveal a certain tension. When a product category begins to rely on minor variations rather than substantial improvements, it suggests that the underlying need may already have been met, or perhaps never truly existed in the first place. The continued production of such items depended less on solving real problems and more on maintaining the momentum of consumption. And this momentum, while powerful, was not entirely stable. It required constant reinforcement through imagery, language, and the careful shaping of expectation point. One of the ways this reinforcement occurred was through the idea of the updated home. Even if a kitchen was already functional, it could always be made more current. A new gadget, a coordinated set of tools, a slightly revised layout. These changes allowed the homeowner to feel aligned with the present moment. The concept of being up to date became its own form of value, separate from strict necessity. This is where the kitchen begins to reflect a broader cultural pattern. The post-war period placed increasing emphasis on keeping pace with change. To fall behind, even in small domestic details, could feel like a kind of quiet failure. And because the kitchen was both practical and visible, it became an ideal site for demonstrating this alignment with the present. A well-maintained, thoughtfully equipped kitchen suggested that the household was not only functioning, but evolving. Yet evolution in this context was not always linear. It moved in cycles. A gadget might be introduced, adopted, questioned, and eventually replaced by something simpler or more refined. In some cases, older tools regained favor precisely because they were easier to use and maintain. This pattern of innovation followed by reassessment created a rhythm that was less about constant progress and more about ongoing adjustment. There is something almost quiet and methodical about that rhythm. It does not announce itself. It does not disrupt the surface appearance of the modern kitchen, but it shapes the underlying reality. It determines which objects remain within reach, which are pushed aside, and which are eventually forgotten. And in doing so, it gradually redefines what the kitchen actually is, beyond its idealized image. Another layer of this evolution can be seen in how time itself was experienced within the kitchen. Earlier in the decade, the promise of time saving had been closely tied to the idea of doing more elaborate meals, more frequent entertaining, more careful presentation. But as routines settled and experience accumulated, a different possibility began to appear, even if only faintly. That saving time might allow for less complexity rather than more. This idea did not immediately overturn existing expectations. The cultural emphasis on well-prepared meals and orderly homes remained strong. But in certain households, particularly those where the demands of daily life were more pressing, there was a growing awareness that efficiency could be used not just to expand activity, but to reduce it. A quicker method might be chosen not to create something more elaborate, but to simplify the process itself. In this context, the appeal of many gadgets began to depend on how they fit into this evolving understanding of time. A tool that genuinely shortened a task without adding complication could be valued. But one that merely shifted effort from one stage to another, or introduced new steps in the name of precision, might feel less convincing. The question was no longer just whether a gadget could perform a task, but whether it improved the overall rhythm of the day. This shift in perspective also brought attention back to a set of skills that had never entirely disappeared. The ability to work efficiently with basic tools, to judge quantities by eye, to manage multiple tasks at once. These forms of practical knowledge remained central to the functioning of the kitchen. Gadgets could assist, but they could not replace the underlying competence that allowed the entire system to operate. And so, even as the market continued to promote new devices, the lived experience of the kitchen began to emphasize a different kind of expertise. It was quieter, less visible, and less easily packaged. It did not depend on owning the latest object, but on knowing how to use what one already had. This expertise was rarely celebrated in advertisements, but it was deeply valued in practice. At the same time, the social environment surrounding the kitchen continued to evolve. The late 1950s saw increasing mobility, both geographic and social. Families moved to new neighborhoods, formed new connections, and adapted to changing expectations. In these settings, the kitchen remained a focal point of interaction, a place where hospitality was expressed and relationships were maintained. Within this social context, the role of the gadget could shift once again. It might serve as a small point of conversation, a shared reference, or even a gentle source of humor. A particularly unusual or impractical device might be discussed with a kind of knowing amusement, acknowledged as part of the broader culture of the time. In this way, the gadget could move from being a serious solution to a more ambiguous object, useful in some moments, symbolic in others. This ambiguity is one of the most interesting aspects of the period. The same object could be seen as helpful, unnecessary, charming, or excessive, depending on the perspective and the situation. It could represent progress or overreach, efficiency or distraction. And these multiple meanings could coexist within the same household, even within the same day. As the decade approached its final years, this layered understanding of the kitchen, both as a functional space and as a cultural symbol, became increasingly important. The gadgets that filled drawers and cabinets were not just tools. They were artifacts of a particular moment in time, shaped by optimism, expectation, and the complexities of everyday life. And while the broader narrative of post-war domestic progress continued to move forward, these small, often overlooked objects remained quietly embedded in the daily routines of the home, carrying with them traces of the promises they had made, the roles they had played, and the gradual, ongoing adjustments that defined the lived reality of the modern kitchen. Carrying with them traces of the promises they had made, the roles they had played, and the gradual, ongoing adjustments that defined the lived reality of the modern kitchen, these objects also began to reveal something else, something quieter, but perhaps more telling about the direction domestic life was heading as the 1950s drew to a close. Because alongside the accumulation and the careful selection, there was a growing sensitivity to friction. Not dramatic failure, not outright rejection, but a subtle awareness of where effort gathered unnecessarily. It might appear in the extra seconds spent rinsing a device with too many grooves, or in the small hesitation before reaching for a tool that required assembly. It might surface when a familiar, simpler method felt more direct, more intuitive, less interruptive to the flow of the task at hand. And over time, these moments of friction began to matter more than the promises that had once justified the purchase. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen uniformly across households. But it created a kind of quiet sorting mechanism, one that operated beneath the surface of the kitchen's polished appearance. Tools that reduced friction tended to stay within easy reach. Tools that introduced it, even in small ways, were gradually moved aside, repositioned, or forgotten. The kitchen, in this sense, began to reorganize itself not according to what had been advertised, but according to what actually felt workable in daily life. That feeling of workability is worth pausing over, because it rarely appears in the language of mid-century marketing. Advertisements spoke of efficiency, hygiene, speed, and modernity. But workability was something more immediate and more personal. It was about how a tool fit into the hand, how quickly it could be cleaned, how naturally it aligned with existing habits. It was less about abstract improvement and more about the rhythm of use. And as homemakers became more attuned to that rhythm, their relationship to gadgets subtly shifted again. A new device was no longer evaluated only on what it promised, but on how it felt to use. Did it interrupt the flow of preparation, or did it blend into it? Did it simplify a sequence of actions, or did it add an extra step that required attention? These were small questions, but they had lasting consequences. At the same time, another influence began to intersect with this evolving sense of practicality: the increasing availability of pre-processed and convenience foods. While still developing in the late 1950s, this trend began to alter the landscape of kitchen labor in ways that were not immediately obvious. Ingredients that once required preparation, peeling, slicing, mixing, could now be purchased in forms that reduced or eliminated those steps. This had a quiet but important effect on the perceived value of certain gadgets. A tool designed to perform a specific preparation task might become less relevant if that task was no longer performed in the same way. A slicer might seem less essential if pre-sliced ingredients were readily available. A mixing aid might lose its appeal if ready-made options reduced the need for extensive preparation. The kitchen, once again, was shifting not through a single transformation, but through the gradual accumulation of small changes. And yet, even as some tasks were simplified or removed, the expectations surrounding the kitchen did not necessarily diminish. If anything, they became more complex. The availability of convenience foods did not always lead to simpler meals. It often led to new forms of presentation, new combinations, and new standards of variety. The homemaker was still expected to produce results that felt modern, thoughtful, and appealing. The means of achieving those results were changing, but the underlying expectation remained. This created an interesting overlap between old and new forms of convenience. A gadget might be designed to simplify a traditional task, while a convenience food might eliminate that task altogether. The homemaker, navigating between these options, had to decide not only how to prepare food, but whether to prepare it in the same way at all. The kitchen became a place where different models of efficiency coexisted: mechanical, procedural, and increasingly commercial. Within this environment, the meaning of saving time became more ambiguous. Was time saved by performing a task more quickly, or by avoiding it altogether? And if time was saved, what was it used for? These questions were not always asked directly, but they were present in the choices being made. A gadget that once seemed appealing because it sped up a task might feel less necessary if that task could be bypassed entirely. At the same time, there remained a strong cultural attachment to the idea of homemade food. Prepared ingredients and packaged options were accepted to varying degrees, but they existed alongside an enduring expectation that meals should still reflect effort and care. This balance between convenience and authenticity added another layer to the decision-making process within the kitchen. A gadget could, in some cases, serve as a bridge between these two worlds. It allowed the homemaker to maintain the appearance of hands-on preparation while benefiting from some degree of assistance. It could shape, finish, or present a dish in a way that suggested involvement, even if part of the process had been simplified. In this sense, the gadget did not merely save time, it helped manage perception. And perception, as it had been throughout the decade, remained a powerful force. The kitchen was still a place where competence was demonstrated, where effort was both visible and invisible, where the final result carried meaning beyond its immediate function. The tools used to achieve that result, whether simple or specialized, new or familiar, were part of a larger system of interpretation. But as the 1950s moved closer to its end, there was also a growing sense that this system was becoming more flexible. The strict alignment between modernity and accumulation was beginning to loosen. It was becoming possible, at least in some contexts, to appear modern without adopting every new device. Practical judgment, informed by experience, was starting to carry more weight. This shift did not eliminate the appeal of new gadgets. The marketplace remained active, and the allure of innovation did not disappear. But it introduced a quieter form of selectivity, one that operated beneath the surface of ongoing consumption. A homemaker might still purchase a new tool, but she was more likely to evaluate it quickly, to decide whether it truly belonged in her routine. And over time, these individual decisions began to shape a more refined version of the modern kitchen, one that was not defined solely by what it contained, but by how it functioned in practice. The drawers might still hold a mixture of objects, some used frequently, others rarely. The counters might still be arranged to suggest order and ease. But beneath that surface, there was an evolving understanding of what actually mattered. That understanding did not announce itself loudly. It did not appear in bold headlines or dramatic shifts. Instead, it moved quietly through the everyday actions of the kitchen, through the tools that were chosen, the ones that were set aside, and the ongoing negotiation between what was promised and what was experienced. And as new ideas, new products, and new expectations continued to emerge at the edge of the coming decade, this quiet negotiation would become even more important, shaping not just the tools of the kitchen, but the very assumptions about what domestic life was meant to be. And as new ideas, new products, and new expectations continued to emerge at the edge of the coming decade, this quiet negotiation would become even more important, shaping not just the tools of the kitchen, but the very assumptions about what domestic life was meant to be. One of the most revealing aspects of this transition is how it changed the meaning of choice inside the kitchen. Earlier in the decade, choice had often been framed as expansion. More options, more devices, more ways to approach each task. But as experience accumulated, choice began to feel less like abundance and more like selection. Not everything that could be used needed to be used. Not every innovation needed to be adopted. And perhaps most importantly, not every problem needed a device to solve it. This shift toward selection was not driven by ideology so much as by habit. It emerged from repetition. When the same task is performed day after day, small inefficiencies become more noticeable. A tool that seemed clever in theory might feel cumbersome in practice. A device that required careful cleaning might feel less appealing after a long day. Over time, these impressions formed a kind of internal hierarchy, one that was rarely written down but was deeply understood. In many kitchens, this hierarchy placed a renewed emphasis on continuity. Tools that had proven themselves over months or years gained a kind of quiet authority. They were trusted. They required little thought. They fit naturally into the flow of work. New gadgets, by contrast, had to earn their place. They were tested, sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes cautiously. And if they failed to integrate smoothly, they were set aside without much ceremony. This process of testing and filtering also had a subtle effect on how new products were perceived from the outset. The initial excitement that surrounded a gadget in a store or a magazine might be tempered by a quiet question. Will this actually fit into my routine? That question, simple as it sounds, marked a shift from passive acceptance to active evaluation. At the same time, the broader cultural narrative continued to evolve, and with it, the way domestic life was represented. The late 1950s and the early years that followed began to place a slightly greater emphasis on personal style and individuality within the home. The kitchen was still expected to be efficient and orderly, but it also became a space where personal taste could be expressed more openly. Color choices, material preferences, and the arrangement of objects began to carry a more distinct sense of identity. This emphasis on individuality introduced another layer to the story of kitchen gadgets. A tool was no longer just a functional object. It could also be a stylistic one. A brightly colored utensil, a sleekly designed appliance, or a coordinated set of accessories could contribute to the overall look of the kitchen. In this context, the value of a gadget might be judged not only by how well it worked, but by how well it fit into the visual language of the space. But this blending of function and style also made the evaluation of usefulness more complex. A device that was rarely used might still be kept because it matched the aesthetic of the kitchen. Conversely, a highly practical tool might be replaced or hidden if it did not align with the desired appearance. The balance between what was useful and what was appropriate became more nuanced, shaped by both practical experience and visual preference. This nuance extended into the social dimension of the kitchen as well. As households continued to entertain, host, and interact within their domestic spaces, the kitchen remained a site of quiet observation. Guests noticed details. They saw how a space was arranged, what kinds of tools were visible, how smoothly tasks were performed. These observations were rarely formalized, but they contributed to a shared understanding of what a well-run kitchen looked like. In this environment, the presence of certain gadgets could carry subtle signals. A carefully chosen set of tools might suggest thoughtfulness and restraint. An abundance of rarely used devices might suggest something else. Perhaps enthusiasm, perhaps excess, perhaps a different interpretation of modernity. These signals were not fixed, and they could be read in multiple ways. But they added another layer to the already complex relationship between objects, identity, and domestic life. Meanwhile, the manufacturers and marketers who produced these gadgets continued to respond to these shifting patterns, even if indirectly. Packaging became more refined. Language became more attentive to the idea of ease and integration rather than just novelty. Instead of presenting a gadget as a revolutionary solution, it might be framed as a helpful addition, a small improvement that fit naturally into an existing routine. This change in tone is subtle, but it reflects an important recognition. By the end of the decade, the consumer was no longer entirely captivated by the promise of novelty alone. There was a growing awareness, shaped by experience, that not every innovation delivered on its claims. And so the messaging adapted, becoming slightly more grounded, slightly more attuned to the realities of daily use. Even so, the cycle of introduction and evaluation continued. New tools appeared, were tested, and either absorbed into the routine or set aside. Old tools remained, sometimes alongside their newer counterparts, creating a layered environment where past and present coexisted. The kitchen became a kind of living archive, reflecting not just current practices, but the history of decisions that had shaped it. And within that archive, the traces of earlier expectations remained visible. A rarely used gadget in the back of a drawer might still carry the memory of its original promise. A coordinated set of tools might reflect a moment when visual unity was especially valued. A well-worn implement might speak to the enduring importance of simplicity and reliability. Each object, in its own way, contributed to a larger narrative about how domestic life had been imagined, experienced, and gradually adjusted. As these layers accumulated, the kitchen also became a space where broader cultural changes could be felt in quiet, practical ways. Shifts in work patterns, in family structure, in available time, all of these influenced how the kitchen was used and what was expected of it. The gadgets within it were not isolated from these changes. They were part of the way those changes were managed and interpreted. This is perhaps one of the most important insights to carry forward. The story of these seemingly trivial objects is not really about the objects themselves. It is about the system they inhabited, the expectations they reflected, the routines they shaped, and the adjustments they required. Each gadget was a small intervention in a much larger process, one that involved not just the preparation of food, but the organization of daily life. And as the decade gave way to new influences and new possibilities, that process did not settle into a fixed form. It remained dynamic, responsive, and sometimes contradictory. The kitchen continued to evolve, not in a single direction, but through a series of overlapping adjustments, each one shaped by the interplay between promise and experience. Within that ongoing evolution, the role of the gadget would remain both familiar and uncertain. It would continue to offer solutions, to suggest improvements, to invite experimentation. But it would also continue to be tested, questioned, and quietly sorted into the rhythms of everyday use, sometimes finding a lasting place, and sometimes slipping, almost unnoticed, into the background of a drawer that held more than just tools, but the accumulated decisions of a life lived in the careful balance between effort and ease, sometimes finding a lasting place, and sometimes slipping, almost unnoticed, into the background of a drawer that held more than just tools, but the accumulated decisions of a life lived in the careful balance between effort and ease. And it is inside that drawer, both literal and symbolic, that another layer of the story begins to reveal itself. Because what gathered there was not only a mix of useful and unnecessary objects, but a quiet record of changing expectations about what the kitchen was supposed to accomplish, and how much of a person's time it was allowed to claim. By the closing years of the 1950s, the idea that domestic work could be endlessly refined through better tools had reached a kind of natural limit. Not a sudden collapse, but a soft boundary. There were only so many ways to slice, peel, press, shape, or dispense before the marginal benefit of each new variation became difficult to justify in everyday terms. And once that boundary was approached, attention began to shift, not entirely away from tools, but toward the structure of the tasks themselves. This is where a subtle but important reorientation takes place. Instead of asking how a specific task could be performed more efficiently, some households began to ask whether the task needed to be performed in the same way at all. It is a small shift in phrasing, but a significant one in practice. It opens the possibility that efficiency might not always mean doing more with less effort, but sometimes doing less with greater clarity. This shift was not driven by a single force. It emerged from a combination of factors that were gradually converging. One was the increasing complexity of daily schedules. As families became more mobile and more socially active, the rhythm of the household became less predictable. Meals had to fit into changing patterns of work, school, and social life. Time became less evenly distributed, and the kitchen had to adapt. Another factor was the growing awareness, again often unspoken, of how much attention domestic work required, even when it appeared to be simplified. The accumulation of small tasks, each supported by its own tool or method, could create a kind of quiet fragmentation. The day was filled not with a single continuous effort, but with many small ones, each requiring its own transition, its own setup, its own completion. In that environment, the appeal of simplification began to extend beyond individual tools to the overall structure of routines. A meal that required fewer steps might be preferred, even if it meant abandoning some of the decorative possibilities offered by specialized gadgets. A method that relied on familiar multipurpose tools might feel more manageable than one that required assembling and disassembling a series of devices. This does not mean that the aesthetic expectations of the era disappeared. Presentation still mattered. The appearance of ease still mattered. But there was a growing recognition that these outcomes could sometimes be achieved through restraint rather than elaboration. A well-prepared, simply presented dish could carry its own sense of modernity, particularly if it aligned with the emerging preference for clarity and efficiency. At the same time, the kitchen itself continued to absorb influences from outside the home. Design trends began to emphasize cleaner lines, more open surfaces, and a slightly more integrated relationship between kitchen and living space. These changes reinforced the visual importance of order, but they also encouraged a reconsideration of what needed to be visible at all. A gadget that disrupted the visual calm of the kitchen, even if it was occasionally useful, might be stored more carefully or used less frequently. Conversely, tools that were both functional and visually aligned with the space might remain within easy reach. The boundary between use and display became more fluid, and objects were evaluated not only for what they did, but for how they contributed to the overall atmosphere of the room. This attention to atmosphere introduced another layer of judgment, one that was less about strict utility and more about coherence. The kitchen was not just a collection of tools. It was an environment, and maintaining that environment required a certain consistency, a sense that each element belonged. Gadgets that felt out of place, either in appearance or in function, were more likely to be set aside, even if they had once been purchased with enthusiasm. There is a quiet discipline in that process. It does not announce itself as minimalism or as a rejection of consumer culture. It simply operates through preference. Over time, the kitchen becomes more selective, not necessarily because fewer products are available, but because the criteria for keeping them becomes more refined. This refinement also changes the emotional relationship between the homemaker and the objects she uses. A tool that remains in regular use becomes familiar, almost reassuring. It does not demand attention. It supports the flow of work without interrupting it. In contrast, a gadget that is rarely used can carry a different kind of emotional weight. It may represent a past intention, a moment of optimism, or a small disappointment. It sits quietly, neither fully integrated nor fully removed. And this emotional dimension adds another layer to the story. The kitchen is not just a functional space. It is also a place where expectations, efforts, and outcomes are experienced on a daily basis. The objects within it participate in that experience, sometimes as helpers, sometimes as reminders. As the decade transitions toward the early 1960s, these patterns of use, evaluation, and quiet adjustment begin to influence the broader direction of domestic design and marketing. Manufacturers, even if they do not articulate it directly, respond to the ways in which their products are actually used. Gadgets that fail to integrate into daily routines are less likely to be repeated in the same form. Those that succeed either through genuine utility or through alignment with emerging preferences are more likely to be refined and continued. At the same time, entirely new categories of products begin to appear, reflecting the changing priorities of the household. Some focus more directly on speed and convenience, aligning with the increasing pace of daily life. Others emphasize storage and organization, responding to the accumulated complexity of the kitchen environment. Still others attempt to bridge the gap between function and style, offering tools that are both useful and visually consistent with modern design. Within this evolving landscape, the role of the individual gadget becomes slightly less central, even as the number of available products continues to grow. The focus shifts almost imperceptibly from the object itself to the system it inhabits. How does this tool fit into the overall routine? How does it interact with other objects? Does it simplify the day, or does it add another layer of management? These questions do not always have clear answers, and they are rarely asked explicitly. But they shape behavior nonetheless. They influence what is purchased, what is used, and what is quietly set aside. And through these accumulated decisions, the kitchen continues to evolve, not as a static ideal, but as a living space shaped by the ongoing negotiation between promise and experience. And as that negotiation continues into the next phase of domestic life, the small, often overlooked gadgets of the 1950s remain present, not only as physical objects, but as markers of a moment when the idea of improvement was closely tied to the act of acquiring, and when the boundaries between necessity, aspiration, and identity were being redrawn in the most ordinary of places. And when the boundaries between necessity, aspiration, and identity began to blur in that way, the kitchen quietly became something more than a place where food was prepared. It became a place where decisions, small, repeated, almost unnoticed, started to define what kind of life felt manageable and what kind of effort felt justified. What is especially striking as the 1950s give way to the early 1960s is how little of this transformation appears dramatic from the outside. The kitchen still looks modern. The counters remain orderly. The cabinets still contain their mixture of tools, old and new. But inside the daily routine, the meaning of those objects has begun to shift. A gadget is no longer simply a sign of progress. It is something to be weighed, tested, and, if necessary, quietly ignored. And this quiet shift introduces a new kind of awareness, one that is less about acquiring and more about managing attention. Because every tool, no matter how small, asks for a certain amount of focus. It has to be remembered, located, used, and put away. When there are too many such tools, attention itself becomes fragmented. The work of the kitchen is no longer just physical. It becomes organizational in a deeper sense, requiring a constant awareness of where things are and how they fit into the sequence of tasks. This is where the earlier promise of effortless efficiency begins to show its limits more clearly. The idea had always been that the right tools would reduce effort. But when the number of tools grows, the nature of the effort changes. It shifts from doing to coordinating, from repeating familiar motions to managing a collection of possibilities. And for many homemakers, this shift is not entirely satisfying. It is not that the gadgets fail completely. Many of them work exactly as intended. But their presence introduces a kind of background complexity that was not always accounted for in their design or their marketing. A simple task becomes one choice among several. A straightforward method becomes one option among many, and the act of choosing itself becomes part of the work. Over time, this awareness begins to influence how routines are structured. Instead of selecting tools based on what is theoretically optimal, Choices are made based on what feels most direct, most familiar, most aligned with the pace of the day. A gadget that requires even a small amount of additional thought might be set aside in favor of a method that flows more naturally, even if it is slightly less precise. This preference for flow over precision is one of the quieter reversals of the period. The earlier emphasis on uniformity, on perfectly shaped slices or evenly formed portions, begins to soften. Not because those qualities are no longer valued, but because they are balanced against the need for continuity in the work itself. The kitchen is not a laboratory. It is a lived space, and its rhythms matter as much as its results. At the same time, the increasing pace of life outside the home begins to exert a stronger influence on what happens within it. Schedules become tighter. Expectations extend beyond the household. The time available for extended preparation or elaborate presentation becomes more variable. In this context, the value of simplicity grows, not as an abstract principle, but as a practical necessity. And this brings the story of the gadget into a slightly different light. What had once been presented as a solution to labor begins, in some cases, to feel like an addition to it. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in the accumulation of small moments, each one requiring a decision, a movement, a bit of attention. This accumulation does not lead to rejection, but to adjustment. The kitchen begins to reorganize itself around a smaller set of trusted tools. The rest remain present, but peripheral. They are used occasionally, sometimes rediscovered, sometimes forgotten again. The space becomes layered not only in objects, but in levels of relevance. And within that layering, a kind of quiet expertise continues to develop. It is not the expertise of owning the right gadget, but of knowing when not to use one. It is the ability to recognize which tools genuinely contribute to the flow of work and which ones interrupt it. This knowledge is rarely formalized, but it is deeply practical, shaped by repetition and experience. At the same time, the broader culture continues to offer new possibilities. The early 1960s begin to introduce different ideas about domestic life, some of which will eventually challenge the assumptions of the previous decade. But at this stage, those ideas are still emerging, still finding their place alongside established expectations. In the kitchen, this creates a kind of overlap. Older habits remain in place, supported by familiar tools and routines. New influences begin to appear, suggesting alternative approaches, different priorities, or new ways of organizing time. The gadget, once again, sits at the intersection of these influences, reflecting both continuity and change. Some devices continue to be refined, becoming more streamlined, easier to clean, more integrated into the overall design of the kitchen. Others remain as they are, gradually losing prominence as the routines around them evolve. And new products enter the space, carrying with them the language of the next phase of domestic life. Language that emphasizes not just efficiency, but flexibility, adaptability, and, increasingly, the idea that time itself might be used differently. But even as these new ideas begin to take shape, the underlying pattern remains consistent. Each object is tested against experience. Each promise is measured against the rhythm of daily life. And each decision, however small, contributes to the ongoing process of defining what the kitchen is for and how it should function. What makes this process so interesting is its quietness. There are no clear turning points, no dramatic shifts that can be easily identified. Instead, there is a steady ACAS and active space where the meaning of convenience, effort, and identity continues to be worked out in the most ordinary, and therefore most revealing ways. The kitchen also becomes a place where something else begins to surface, an awareness not just of how work is done, but of how it is experienced over time. Because once the initial excitement of new tools has passed, what remains is not the promise, but the repetition. The same meals, the same surfaces, the same sequence of preparation and cleanup, returning day after day. And within that repetition, even the smallest inefficiencies begin to stand out more clearly than they ever could in a showroom or a magazine spread. This is where the contrast between imagined use and actual use becomes especially visible. A gadget might be demonstrated as part of a single, contained task, a neat, efficient moment with a clear beginning and end. But in reality, that task is embedded within a longer chain of actions. It begins with preparation, continues through cooking, and ends with cleaning and storage. And it is only when the gadget is placed within that full sequence that its true value becomes apparent. A tool that performs well in isolation may not perform as well in context. It might interrupt the flow between steps. It might require attention at a moment when attention is already divided. It might add an extra layer of work at the end of the process, when energy is already low. These are not dramatic failures, but they accumulate, shaping how the tool is perceived over time. And as these experiences accumulate, they begin to influence not only which gadgets are used, but how the entire process of cooking is approached. The emphasis shifts slightly, from optimizing individual steps to maintaining continuity across the whole routine. A method that allows the cook to move smoothly from one task to the next may be preferred over one that offers isolated efficiencies, but disrupts the overall flow. Accumulation of adjustments, each one responding to the last. The kitchen evolves not through sudden change, but through continuous refinement. And in that refinement, the story of the 1950s kitchen gadgets becomes something more than a collection of curious objects. It becomes a record of how people adapt to the tools they are given, how they negotiate between expectation and reality, and how they gradually reshape their environment to better fit the demands of everyday life. As the next phase begins to take clearer form, the kitchen remains at the center of that process, not as a static symbol of modernity, but as an active space where the meaning of convenience, effort, and identity continues to be worked out in the most ordinary, and therefore most revealing ways. As an active space where the meaning of convenience, effort, and identity continues to be worked out in the most ordinary, and therefore most revealing ways, the kitchen also becomes a place where something else begins to surface, an awareness not just of how work is done, but of how it is experienced over time. Because once the initial excitement of new tools has passed, what remains is not the promise, but the repetition. The same meals, the same surfaces, the same sequence of preparation and cleanup, returning day after day. And within that repetition, even the smallest inefficiencies begin to stand out more clearly than they ever could in a showroom or a magazine spread. This is where the contrast between imagined use and actual use becomes especially visible. A gadget might be demonstrated as part of a single, contained task, a neat, efficient moment with a clear beginning and end. But in reality, that task is embedded within a longer chain of actions. It begins with preparation, continues through cooking, and ends with cleaning and storage. And it is only when the gadget is placed within that full sequence that its true value becomes apparent. A tool that performs well in isolation may not perform as well in context. It might interrupt the flow between steps. It might require attention at a moment when attention is already divided. It might add an extra layer of work at the end of the process, when energy is already low. These are not dramatic failures, but they accumulate, shaping how the tool is perceived over time. And as these experiences accumulate, they begin to influence not only which gadgets are used, but how the entire process of cooking is approached. The emphasis shifts slightly, from optimizing individual steps to maintaining continuity across the whole routine. A method that allows the cook to move smoothly from one task to the next may be preferred over one that offers isolated efficiencies but disrupts the overall flow. This preference for continuity also affects how time is perceived. Earlier in the decade, the promise of saving time was often framed in terms of measurable gains. Minutes reduced from a task, steps eliminated from a process. But in practice, time is experienced less as a series of measurements and more as a rhythm. It is felt in the ease or strain of moving through a sequence of actions, in the sense of whether a task unfolds smoothly or requires constant adjustment. In this context, a gadget that saves a minute but interrupts the rhythm of work may feel less valuable than one that saves no measurable time but supports a smoother progression from start to finish. This is a subtle distinction, but it has real consequences. It shifts the focus from efficiency as a numerical concept to efficiency as a lived experience. At the same time, the kitchen continues to reflect the broader cultural emphasis on order and control. The arrangement of tools, the organization of storage, the clarity of surfaces, all of these contribute to a sense that the space is manageable, that the work within it can be contained and directed. But this sense of control is always balanced against the unpredictability of daily life. Unexpected interruptions, changing schedules, and varying demands all require a degree of flexibility that no fixed system can fully provide. And it is in this balance between control and flexibility that the limitations of highly specialized gadgets become more apparent. A tool designed for a single, narrowly defined task may function perfectly under ideal conditions, but it may be less adaptable when circumstances change. In contrast, simpler, more versatile tools can be adjusted to fit a wider range of situations, making them more resilient in the face of everyday variability. This resilience becomes increasingly important as the kitchen adapts to new patterns of use. Meals may be prepared more quickly or at different times. Tasks may be interrupted and resumed. The boundaries between preparation, serving, and cleanup may blur. In this environment, the ability to move easily between different modes of work becomes a form of efficiency in its own right. And once again, the presence of too many specialized gadgets can complicate that movement. Each additional tool represents a fixed point within the system, a specific way of doing something. When there are too many such points, the system becomes less flexible, less able to adapt to changing conditions. The kitchen, in effect, becomes more rigid than the life it is meant to support. This realization does not lead to a wholesale rejection of gadgets, but it does contribute to a gradual rebalancing. The emphasis shifts toward tools that support adaptability, that can be used in multiple ways, that do not require the cook to commit to a single method from the outset. The ideal becomes not just efficiency, but ease of adjustment. At the same time, the emotional dimension of kitchen work continues to play an important role. The satisfaction of completing a task smoothly, the quiet confidence that comes from using a familiar tool, the relief of avoiding unnecessary complication, these experiences shape preferences just as much as any practical consideration. A gadget that undermines these feelings, even slightly, may be set aside in favor of one that supports them. And this brings us back to the broader cultural context in which these decisions are made. The 1950s had promoted a vision of domestic life that was orderly, efficient, and visibly successful. The kitchen gadgets of the time were part of that vision, offering tangible ways to achieve it. But as the decade progresses, the lived experience of that vision begins to reveal its complexities. Efficiency is not always simple. Order is not always effortless. And the tools that promise to simplify life can sometimes introduce new forms of complexity that are less visible, but equally significant. As the early 1960s begin to take shape, these insights do not immediately transform the kitchen, but they begin to influence the way it is understood. The focus shifts slightly from the accumulation of tools to the management of experience, from the promise of improvement to the reality of daily use. And within this evolving understanding, the role of the gadget continues to change. It is no longer just an object to be acquired, but one to be integrated or not into a system that is constantly being adjusted. Its value is determined not only by what it can do, but by how it fits into the broader pattern of life within the home. That pattern, in turn, continues to evolve, shaped by forces both inside and outside the kitchen. And as those forces gather, bringing new expectations, new constraints, and new possibilities, the quiet process of evaluation and adjustment that has defined the latter part of the 1950s begins to set the stage for a different kind of domestic environment, one that will carry forward some of the same questions, but approach them in ways that are still just beginning to emerge. Point one that will carry forward some of the same questions, but approach them in ways that are still just beginning to emerge, and not always in the places one might expect. Because as the early 1960s begin to take shape, the kitchen does not simply continue along the same path. Instead, it starts to absorb a new kind of influence, one that is less focused on perfecting the mechanics of domestic work and more concerned with how that work fits into the broader structure of everyday life. This influence does not arrive suddenly. It appears in small shifts, in how time is allocated, in how routines are prioritized, in how much attention is given to the details that had once been emphasized so heavily. And in this changing environment, the role of the gadget begins to feel slightly different again. Not obsolete, but less central to the idea of what makes a kitchen function well. Where earlier years had framed improvement as a matter of adding the right tools, there is now a quiet movement toward removing unnecessary steps. Not in a dramatic or ideological sense, but in a practical one. If a process can be shortened without loss, it often is. If a task can be simplified without drawing attention to that simplification, it often is. And if a tool does not clearly contribute to that outcome, it may remain present, but it loses its importance. This creates a subtle but meaningful distinction between ownership and use. A kitchen may still contain a wide range of gadgets, but only a smaller portion of them actively shape the daily routine. The rest exist in a kind of suspended state, available but not essential. Their presence is a reminder of past expectations, but their influence on current practice is limited. And this distinction matters because it changes how the kitchen is experienced. Instead of being defined by what it contains, it is increasingly defined by what is actually done within it. The focus shifts from the inventory of tools to the pattern of actions, from the potential of the space to its lived reality. At the same time, the broader cultural environment continues to evolve in ways that subtly reinforce this shift. There is a growing awareness, still developing, that time within the home is not an unlimited resource. The demands placed on it, whether through family, social life, or emerging forms of work and engagement, require a different kind of balance. The kitchen must still function effectively, but it must do so within a more complex schedule. In this context, the value of a gadget becomes even more closely tied to its ability to integrate smoothly into that schedule. A device that requires attention at the wrong moment, or that complicates a sequence of tasks, may be set aside not because it is ineffective, but because it does not align with the rhythm of the day. This alignment between tool and timing, between method and moment, becomes a quiet but powerful criterion. It is rarely articulated, but it is felt, and it shapes behavior in ways that are more consistent and more lasting than the initial appeal of novelty. Another development that begins to influence the kitchen during this period is the gradual normalization of a slightly more informal approach to domestic presentation. The earlier emphasis on precise shaping, decorative detail, and visual uniformity does not disappear, but it becomes one option among several rather than an absolute standard. Meals can still be carefully arranged, but they can also be simpler, more direct, less mediated by specialized tools. This shift does not necessarily reduce effort, but it redistributes it. Attention may move away from the fine details of presentation and toward the broader flow of the meal. The emphasis becomes less about perfecting each individual element and more about ensuring that the entire process unfolds smoothly. In this environment, the role of the gadget becomes more selective. It is used when it clearly supports the desired outcome, and set aside when it does not. The idea that every task should have its own dedicated tool loses some of its force, replaced by a more flexible approach that values adaptability over specialization. At the same time, the visual language of the kitchen continues to evolve, and with it, the way objects are perceived. Clean lines, coordinated colors, and integrated storage solutions become more prominent, reinforcing the sense that the kitchen is a unified space rather than a collection of separate elements. This emphasis on unity further encourages the reduction of visible clutter, which in turn affects how often certain gadgets are used. A tool that disrupts the visual coherence of the space may be stored more carefully, making it less accessible and therefore less likely to be used. Over time, this can lead to a gradual decline in its relevance, even if its function remains unchanged. The design of the kitchen, in this sense, begins to influence not just how tools are arranged, but how they are incorporated into daily life. And as these patterns continue to develop, the kitchen becomes a space where multiple layers of decision-making intersect. There is the practical layer, concerned with efficiency and ease. There is the visual layer, concerned with order and appearance. And there is the temporal layer, concerned with how tasks fit into the flow of the day. Each of these layers influences the others, creating a complex system in which even small changes can have broader effects. Within this system, the gadget remains present, but its role is no longer fixed. It can be a solution, a convenience, a decoration, or a distraction, depending on how it is used and how it fits into the larger pattern. Its value is not inherent, but contextual, shaped by the specific conditions of the household in which it exists. And this contextual nature is what makes the story of these objects so revealing. They do not simply reflect a set of static preferences. They respond to changing circumstances, adapting, or failing to adapt to the evolving needs of the people who use them. As the early 1960s continue to unfold, this process of adaptation becomes more pronounced. New products enter the market, some building on the ideas of the previous decade, others introducing new approaches altogether. At the same time, the accumulated experience of the 1950s continues to inform how these products are received, creating a dynamic interplay between past expectations and present realities. The kitchen, once again, sits at the center of this interplay, absorbing new influences while retaining the traces of earlier ones. And within its cabinets, drawers, and carefully arranged surfaces, the small, often overlooked gadgets of the previous decade remain. Some still in use, others quietly set aside, each one marking a point along the ongoing path of adjustment, where the meaning of convenience continues to be tested against the lived experience of everyday life. And as those tests continue, something else begins to emerge with a little more clarity. A growing separation between what the kitchen is expected to represent and what it actually needs to do. Because by the early 1960s, the kitchen is no longer just a symbol of modern efficiency. It is becoming, more noticeably, a space that must accommodate variation. Not every day looks the same. Not every meal follows the same pattern. Not every household operates under identical assumptions. And as these differences become more visible, the idea that a single, perfectly equipped system could meet all needs begins to feel less convincing. This is where the earlier emphasis on universal solutions, the notion that a particular gadget could serve every home equally well, starts to weaken. In its place, a more individualized approach begins to take hold. A tool that works well in one kitchen may be unnecessary in another. A method that feels efficient in one routine may feel awkward in a different context. The kitchen becomes less standardized in practice, even as its visual language remains relatively consistent. And within that emerging individuality, the role of the gadget becomes more selective, more conditional. It is no longer assumed that every task requires a dedicated device. Instead, the question becomes whether the device genuinely improves the specific conditions in which it is used. This change in perspective is subtle, but it alters the way decisions are made. A purchase is no longer justified solely by the promise of improvement. It must also pass a quieter test, one that is based on memory, habit, and the accumulated knowledge of what has worked before. And that accumulated knowledge, by this point, is considerable. A decade of experimentation has left its mark. Drawers and cabinets contain not just tools but evidence. Evidence of what was tried, what was kept, what was set aside. Each object carries a small history, a record of its place within the shifting routines of the household. In this sense, the kitchen becomes a kind of archive, not a formal one, but a practical one. It reflects the decisions that have been made over time, the adjustments that have been necessary, and the ways in which expectations have been negotiated. The gadgets of the 1950s, whether still in use or quietly forgotten, remain part of that archive, offering clues about the assumptions that shaped them. At the same time, the cultural environment continues to introduce new expectations, some of which begin to challenge earlier ideas about domestic life. The concept of convenience itself starts to broaden. It is no longer limited to the mechanics of preparation, but extends to the overall experience of managing a household within a changing social landscape. This broader view of convenience brings with it a different set of priorities. Flexibility becomes more important. The ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, whether in schedule, resources, or energy, begins to take precedence over the ability to perform a single task with precision. And this shift has direct implications for how tools are valued. A gadget that excels in a narrow context may struggle to justify its place in a more fluid environment. Its usefulness is tied to a specific set of conditions, and when those conditions are not present, it remains idle. In contrast, a simpler, more adaptable tool can be applied in multiple ways, making it more consistently relevant. This does not mean that specialized tools disappear. They remain part of the landscape, particularly in households where their specific functions align with established routines. But their role becomes more clearly defined. They are used when needed, rather than relied upon as general solutions. At the same time, the increasing emphasis on adaptability begins to influence how new products are designed and marketed. There is a gradual movement toward versatility, toward tools that can perform multiple functions or fit into a variety of situations. This reflects an understanding, whether explicit or intuitive, that the kitchen is no longer a static environment, but one that must respond to changing demands. And yet, even as this movement takes shape, the legacy of the 1950s remains visible. The language of efficiency, the appeal of modern design, the association between tools and identity, all of these continue to influence how the kitchen is perceived. The difference is that they are now filtered through a more experienced lens, one that is shaped by a decade of lived reality. This filtering process is not always conscious, but it is consistent. It operates through small decisions repeated over time. Which tool is reached for first? Which one is left in the drawer? Which one is replaced and which one is kept? These decisions may seem minor, but they collectively define the functioning of the kitchen. And within this functioning, a new kind of balance begins to emerge. It is not a balance between old and new, or between simple and complex, but between expectation and experience. The kitchen continues to absorb new ideas, but it does so selectively, integrating what works and setting aside what does not. This selective integration is what allows the space to remain stable even as it evolves. The core routines remain intact, supported by a set of trusted tools and methods. Around that core, new elements are introduced, tested, and either incorporated or discarded. The result is a system that is both consistent and adaptable, capable of responding to change without losing its underlying structure. And it is within this system that the meaning of the gadget continues to shift. It is no longer defined solely by its novelty or its promise, but by its ability to find a place within the existing pattern. A successful gadget is one that becomes almost invisible, so well integrated into the routine that it no longer draws attention to itself. This invisibility is, in a way, the final measure of usefulness. A tool that works seamlessly does not need to announce its presence. It supports the flow of work without interrupting it. It becomes part of the rhythm, rather than a disruption to it. In contrast, a gadget that remains visible, one that is noticed, considered, and perhaps questioned each time it is used, has not fully achieved that integration. It remains an option rather than a solution, a possibility rather than a necessity. And as the kitchen continues to evolve through the early 1960s, this distinction becomes increasingly important. The difference between what is integrated and what is merely present begins to define the character of the space. The drawers still contain their mixture of objects, some active, some dormant. The counters still reflect a careful balance between use and appearance. The routines still unfold in patterns that are both familiar and adaptable. But beneath all of this, the process of selection continues, shaping the kitchen in ways that are gradual, cumulative, and deeply connected to the lived experience of those who use it. And as new products, new ideas, and new expectations continue to arrive, that process does not pause. It continues quietly, guiding the integration of each new element into a system that is always adjusting, always refining, and always responding to the changing realities of everyday life. And as that process continues, quietly, almost invisibly, shaping what stays and what fades, the story of those peculiar little kitchen gadgets begins to settle into something more complete. Because by the time we step back and look at them with a little distance, they no longer seem quite as foolish as they first appeared. They were, in many cases, unnecessary. Some were poorly designed. Others solved problems that hardly existed. And many did end up exactly where you might expect, at the back of a drawer, used once or twice, then quietly forgotten. But that is only part of what they were. They were also expressions of a very particular moment in history, a moment when the home was being reimagined as a place of progress, when technology was not just something distant and industrial, but something that could sit on a countertop or slip into a cabinet and promise to improve everyday life. They were attempts, sometimes awkward, sometimes optimistic, to make domestic work feel lighter, more controlled, more modern. And perhaps most importantly, they reveal how people actually lived through that promise. Not by accepting it completely, not by rejecting it outright, but by testing it, adapting it, and quietly reshaping it to fit the reality of their own routines. Because what ultimately defined the 1950s kitchen was not the gadgets themselves, but the way they were absorbed into daily life. Some found a permanent place, some were used occasionally, and many simply remained, small reminders of what had once been expected. And if you were to open one of those drawers today, the kind that hasn't been fully cleared out in decades, you might still find them there. A neatly designed slicer, curious little press, a tool with a very specific purpose that no longer quite makes sense. And each one, in its own quiet way, would tell the same story, not just about what people bought, but about what they hoped would make life easier, and what, in the end, actually did. If you've made it this far, I'd be curious, what's one everyday tool or habit you think people today rely on that might feel just as strange decades from now? And if you enjoy these slower, thoughtful journeys into the past, you're always welcome to stay a little longer with the channel. There's always another story waiting, just beneath the surface of something ordinary.